Staring at a record $145 billion in stressed loans in FY18, the Indian banking sector is facing a crisis of confidence and capital, forcing the government and the regulator to go back to the drawing board to find a solution. Just last week, after a meeting with top bankers, the interim Finance Minister Piyush Goyal has announced the setting up of a committee to look at the possibility of creating an asset reconstruction or an asset management company to house big-ticket bad loans. To add to the NPA woes is the issue of bank fraud. In a deposition to a parliamentary committee, RBI Governor Urjit Patel revealed a 16% rise in bank frauds in FY18 worth a whopping 32,000 crore rupees. That's a 35% rise in value when compared to FY17. The governor has also made a fresh pitch for more control over public sector banks in line with the RBI's supervisory powers over private sector banks. So on this edition of Eye on India, we re-examine the issue of transforming public sector banks. Is a bad bank a good idea? Is PSB consolidation the need of the hour? And what about capital? According to a preliminary estimate, public sector banks will face a cumulative capital shortage of 2,71,000 crore rupees to meet the Basel III capital norms in FY19. So where will this money come from? To answer this and more, we are joined today by Anil Khandelwal, the former member of the Bank Board Bureau and former CMD of the Bank of Baroda. Also with us, Arun Tiwari, the former CMD of Union Bank of India, and Abizer Diwanji, partner and national leader, financial services at EY India. Gentlemen, appreciate you joining us here on the show. Mr. Khandelwal, let me come to you, sir, with the idea that seems to be back on the table, and that is the idea of an ARC or an AMC, or loosely, if you can call it, the bad bank. Now, this was an idea that was suggested by the Chief Economic Advisor, Arvind Subramaniam. Didn't go very far. There seems to have been opposition even within the Finance Ministry itself on taking this forward. Now, just last week, the government, after its conversation with bankers, seems to be more confident of being able to take this forward. Do you think that a bad bank is a good idea today?
I think bad bank has been talked about in the past also. I don't think it's a good idea to have a bad bank, because already the banks which have high degree of NPAs are already bad banks as far as the NPAs are concerned. And if you transfer all these assets to bad bank, there is an issue of capital, where from you bring capital. And I think it's a transfer of a problem. Each bank should be seen as an independent entity who are supposed to tackle their good and bad part. I do believe that although currently banking sector and banks are saddled with lot of problems and the perception issues, I, for one, am extremely optimistic that going beyond NPA and some of the key issues, the issues are one of fundamental transformation, 360-degree transformation, where the transformation is required in regard to Reserve Bank of India, in regard to government, in regard to individual banks. I think we are missing woods for trees, and that we are not able to see the total picture.
Okay, missing the woods for the trees, and a bad bank is merely the transfer one problem from one balance sheet to another. Mr. Tiwari, would you agree with that? What we are given to understand is that the government at this point in time is looking at transferring the bad assets of PSBs into this national ARC, that the existing shareholders of these banks will get a proportionate share in this new companies. The banks will demerge their NPL portfolio and transfer assets to the national ARC at a fair value. I mean, this is what we're given to understand is the thinking at this point in time. Would you agree with Mr. Khandelwal that this is really the transfer of a problem from one bank to another, and it is missing the woods for the trees?
Yes, partially I do agree with Dr. Khandelwal, but the issue is perhaps where from this is coming to the government is, if all the banks, 11 of them being under PCA, they can't do much. If they have to, going forward, to start working and start lending, so cleanup. Now, cleanup is not just that you take out the loan from one institution to another institution. It's much beyond that. It's not talking just about the resolution. It's about the recovery and resolution both. So perhaps what might be thinking is, if you shift these bad assets to one entity, and this has been done in the China. If you remember, sometime around 1997 to 2000 period, these big four banks back in China, all the bad assets were transferred to 4 state-owned enterprises. And these state-owned enterprises, they were funded by government of China. And how they were funded is another interesting story. What they did, they like something what we have here, SLR, CRR, they reduced that. So whatever was the differential surplus with the banks, they put them in the bonds, came back to the banks as capitalization, bad assets transferred to this 4 ARCs or SOEs back in China. Balance sheets were cleaned up. All these 4 banks went overseas, got them listed at New York Stock Exchange, Hong Kong Stock Exchange, Beijing Stock Exchange at a premium. So whatever premium came, they paid it back to the government. So it was just a book entry, but it worked for a while. But after 10 years, 15 years time frame, they are back at the same place. So I think experiment like IPL, Shereen was also an experiment to begin with. If it was not for IPL, many players would have left, would have ended their career in Ranji Trophy and Duleep Trophy. So an experiment and a limited, if the time space, if it's done, I think it should be given a chance.
It should be given a chance. Abizer, do you believe that it should be given a chance? And let's talk about the capital requirement as well, because what one is hearing is that the government may in fact tap into the NIIF to be able to provide the capital for this national ARC as and when it were to be set up. Do you believe that this is the need of the hour today?
See, whether you do an ARC or whether you don't do an ARC, frankly, that's not the moot point. The moot point is that you will need capital, and as your numbers rightly flash, you need around 2,70,000 odd crores of capital. Now, unless that capital comes in, you're not going to be able to wipe out your books. Now, whether that capital is required in the bank or in the proposed bank is immaterial, frankly. But the capital is surely required. Question is that how do you, there are 3 big problems today in resolution of assets. One is capital, as you rightly said. 2 is aggregation of exposures. I mean, we sit in joint lenders forum with 20 bankers and none of them are able to take a decision. If somebody is able to aggregate exposures or even aggregate decision making, I guess we'll be better off. Now, in whatever form that can happen.
Okay.
And the third and the final thing is, do we really have the expertise to do resolution? I frankly think bankers per se are very good at lending. They're not necessarily good at recovering in stress situations. So frankly, if we can get these things done, we'll be able to maximize it. Whether you do a bad bank or you don't do a bad bank, in my view, is a moot.
If the government were to provide the kind of capital that Abizer and I were just discussing, then what happens to the kind of shareholding the government already has? I mean, it will exceed 90% in most cases. And here we're talking about transformation. We're talking about diversifying ownership as far as public sector banks is concerned in the quest to improve governance. So, you know, where does this leave us then?
You are right that if government keeps providing capital, there are 2 consequences. One is, we should not forget whose money is this. This is the money of the taxpayer, and I think Indian taxpayer is quite, has a large heart in watching all this. But I think beyond a point, it won't work. That is one thing. Second thing is, what happens to the government equity? On one hand, we are talking about that government should dilute its equity. If you keep on providing the measured numbers, the government equity will rise around 90%. So I think there is a bit of contradiction, and therefore the important issue is that we need to see banking problem as not the immediate, in the sense of that we somehow want to get rid of it, but we need a little longer time frame and strengthen banks. Allow them to take measures in terms of profit maximization, in terms of lot of rationalization of different kind, including manpower and including the branches. You see, we cannot keep on expanding on one hand and pray to God we need to take some tough decisions. I think it's time that we need to think beyond our normal range of thinking, that no stakeholder should feel disturbed by any transformation. I think the comfort zone needs to be shifted, need to be disturbed, and some tough measures are required.
So if you're saying that if you're saying that we need to get out of our comfort zone and some tough decisions need to be taken, what kind of tough decisions are we talking about, sir? I mean, if you go back to 2008 and look at what happened in the US, for instance, more than 20-odd banks were allowed to fail. I mean, is that a possibility at all in a country like India?
Look, while this may be not relevant to India in terms of closing a bank or in terms of really getting rid of bad banks and all that. But I think short of that, the message, we don't find message going around. There is a certain degree of sameness in the banking sector. There are banks which are at nadir in terms of their figures, NPA figures, and there are banks who are doing reasonably well, and there are banks you can be optimistic about. So, now, you cannot have a same yardstick to, you have to now have a bank-wise strategy. And some tough decision, at this point of time, I would only say that the tough decisions require putting some banks on notice in terms of giving them time and giving them a certain framework and giving them a certain degree of expectation and also helping them and hand-holding them.
Well, time for us to head into a break, but there is a lot more coming up on what needs to be done to transform India's public sector banks. That and more when we return.